Welcome to the AI The Future of Us, a podcast-style video series that explores the ways AI is shaping our future and how we can prepare for the changes that lie ahead. I am your host, Firat Tekiner, and today we are joined by Dave Nettleton, Product Lead in Data Analytics. Thank you for being here today, Dave.
Thank you, Firat. Excited to be here and look forward to chatting with you today.
Thank you. So let's start. And let's start with your background and expertise. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in the field of data and AI and what you have been doing?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I started many years ago with an undergrad in maths, which became then a PhD actually in artificial intelligence. And from there, I went on to be an academic at a university in the UK, where we were funding a lot of our work through projects we were doing, building telephony, inquiry systems, doing text analysis. And we actually eventually spun a company out from the university to do that. We built all kinds of interesting products. We grew. We were acquired by a company in the Valley, and then building intelligent chatbots for the internet. This was in the late 90s. We then blew up with them actually as part of the dot-com boom, at which point I came over to America, started on the data part of my journey, joined Microsoft, worked on databases, data and analytics for many years, worked on storage for a while, some of the early days of Azure. And then that brought me to Google 7 years ago, where I've been working on storage and data analytics, and more recently now bringing back some of those AI capabilities into the products. So yeah, been great to just work with so many customers through that journey.
Wow, that's amazing. And our journey is fine enough, is very, very similar because I started with the PhD in AI and moved into data, but I haven't been as successful as you have been so far. So let's see. and can you share some of the data and AI developments that you have witnessed in your awesome career as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I go back, there's been kind of traditionally two ways to do artificial intelligence, right? Sort of the rule-based techniques and then the stats-based and neural networks techniques. So there was always this sort of tension between the two because rules-based is very good in a particular domain, but really struggled with ambiguity when you would step outside of that. Stats-based, really good at dealing with ambiguity, but then struggles when you want to be something that's really specific. And for me, it's been really interesting to see sort of the evolution over the last few decades because, stats-based techniques were so limited that rules-based was actually, a mechanism for a while that many people pursued. But as processing power improved, algorithms improved, and the amount of data available improved, then the ability to deal with really scale stats-based approaches were really good. And then, one big step forward on the NL side was the introduction of the T in the transform, right, which really helped with some of this better understanding of the ambiguity in text, which is phenomenally difficult to deal with. It's really interesting. I remember back in the day, we used to talk about recall and precision. There's much cooler names now, like hallucination, which I think is far much cooler, right? But I think there's this super interesting opportunity now to really marry the best of these two best practices, right? Using things like LLMs and GenAI to manage some of the ambiguity, but then tying it together with specific domain knowledge that you have about your organization just to help refine the accuracy of answers. So very exciting time. The step functions in processing power and algorithms coupled with the amount of data has just now led to this leapfrog in capability, which we're seeing play out now over the last year.
And it's interesting, right? And I think you are spot on. It is all about the three things, that the data and the algorithms, but also the compute. And what we are seeing, I think, is that the data and AI has been, treated as two separate disciplines in the past, and they are coming together. And also we are seeing the other end convergence of the AI and, compute, which is coming to HPC to deal with all of this, and scale is getting much bigger, right? But I also want to, understand a little bit around what are the challenges that you see closing this gap that I mentioned around the data engineering and data analytics side with the machine learning, because you have been very experienced in both of them. How can we bring them together?
Yeah, so great question. So one of the challenges always in data and analytics has been that you have to move data between different systems for different types of specialist processing, right? So in the traditional days, customers would run transactional systems that have an OLTP system. They would ETL data out of that into a data warehouse. They would shape it in a particular format to answer the reporting questions that they knew. And that was how businesses ran for many years, running reports to retroactively ask questions on their business, right? And this created, data silos, very well governed data, but it was very siloed, right? And what customers were finding is but there is so much more, the volume of data, the variety of data that was really, really increasing astronomically, that led to completely different paradigms for something like MapReduce, right? Which ultimately led to Hadoop, which allowed for very large scale, scaled out processing to happen, which was, again, phenomenal for doing things at super large scale that couldn't be done before, which was, you couldn't do in the other world where you typically had these scaled up systems. But the challenge was then it led to this completely ungoverned mess, right? So I think there's a couple of things that the cloud has really enabled, right? So number one is it's enabled customers to truly separate compute from storage, right? So you can scale compute separately from storage. You don't have to buy a fixed size system, operate it, and then when it runs out of scale, move data to some other system and optimize that. You can truly separate compute from storage, which is very, very powerful. And then secondly is then bringing the algorithms to the data, right? And this is, again, something that the cloud uniquely enables. If you have that compute storage separation and you can bring algorithms to data, that's unthinkable on premises. You mentioned you could build a very high performance, scaled up, super optimized system, but then that's it. You have to, that's the only thing that you can operate. Everything else, you're copying data to or copying data from, right? The beauty of the cloud and this huge step function forward we have is this, separation of compute and storage, and the ability to bring compute to that data. Now, that's played out particularly well for products like BigQuery, right, which is a really large-scale data warehousing product and platform. But as we carry forward into the world of AI and more recently Gen AI, that whole paradigm now of being able to combine the best of structured data that's represented and defined in a well-defined way that your engines can operate over and trust to do things like row level and column level security. And as we think about, object tables out in something like GCS where we can bring unstructured data, I'm sure we'll come back to that one, then we have a single way now to manage all of this data. And again, we can bring those ML algorithms to bear over that. We've even built it into the product BigQuery with a feature called BigQuery ML, which lets you run things in the warehouse, but also tie into your own and third-party models too.
I think you're right. And within that, so one of the things that happen is, I spend a lot of time in supercomputers and AI, but it didn't become mainstream, right? It was very niche at the end of the day. It required lots of, very specialized people to, operate them. And I think cloud made that really, more mainstream, as you alluded into. What are the data governance challenges that you have been seeing within this, as well? Because now we are bringing unstructured data, which is much harder to understand what's inside because there is no structure around it. You cannot look into certain columns and such. Yes, you can search into that. But at the same time, you are bringing different types of data from a lot more systems as well, which you might not have that close and tight control around that. And you might also not have that, annotated business metadata around that, explaining that to you as well. So how do you think that we'll be, able to deal with all of that as well?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned one extra thing about the benefits of cloud, right? Which is that sort of self-service nature. That's been hugely empowering for many organizations. They don't need to set up infrastructure to get going. Now, the challenge there is now many people in an organization can get going. And so now they start to think about governance, lineage. These have been problems that, companies have looked to solve for many years. And I think they're going to see an additional level of interest there, because as we start to think about, I talked about that workflow of, analyzing data with an LLM model and dealing with ambiguity, but then perhaps refining it with business data. customers are going to want to be able to understand the sort of the lineage of not just the data, but of the decision making that went into this answer. It's like, okay, I ask a question, what are my annual sales? A number pops up. Okay, next question. Where did that data come from? Right? And can you explain how it was derived to me? Right? Those are the sorts of experiences that we want to enable, where a completely different class of user can start to ask some of those, relatively simple to phrase, but incredibly difficult to answer potentially questions. So we need to be able to have things like lineage, data quality, metadata governance kind of baked into this as a first-class system. And sometimes when we talk about like the journey that customers are on, the customer maturity model, sometimes we call it. Sometimes we start with like customers might start in data silos. Data is siloed in different places and different systems. You don't even know and can't even see across them, right? Then then there's the concept of a data mesh, right, where there's a single, definitive namespace copy for your data, right, with additional, metadata and business governance things on that, right? But that's great. But ultimately, you want to get to the last stage, which is data apps, right? Like you only get value out of your data when you're running analytics against your data, right? So how can we make it easier then to sort of leverage all of that foundation and build applications that are super easy to deploy, to use, to fully operationalize, run automatically, run on your behalf. They warn you if they're starting to drift based on parameters that you set, right? Like there's a whole new world of operationalization and optimization here, and tying it back to lineage and data quality and governance will be very important, because if we want to meet a new set of users, and I think when customers came to the cloud, the data people I talk to now are data engineers, data scientists, and data analysts, right? I don't really talk to database administrators anymore, right? Like their roles have changed, right? They're now doing FinOps or workload management. They're doing different higher level governed things for their organization, right? And what I think we have the opportunity for is also now to enable new classes of users to do not everything, but some of the things that data engineers, data scientists, data analysts do in a much simplified, now user-based experience. But in order to have the privilege of doing that, we have to be able to explain what the results are and where they came from.
Yeah. And that's the key point for having the data governance, really applying, as you said, starting from the way that where the data is generated, it propagates all the way through into your ML applications now. This is where all the, explainability comes into the play as well, because if you understand all your data sources, where they're coming from, it is much easier to understand, and explain what it is doing as well, right? You have more control over that. But with how do you see the data warehousing with LLMs in mind evolving as well? You alluded into, all of these personas coming through the number of ways that LLMs can help, and that's not the only way as well, right? So what's your views on that?
Yeah. No, great question. So, applying AI to data has always been something that we've been, certainly from the BigQuery perspective, thinking about and working on for quite some time now. And I think GenAI is going to be transformational for many businesses. Some parts of that journey, though, are incremental to what we're doing. And there's some things that are sort of, fresh ground for us, right? Some of the things that we, think about incrementally is like, we want to have the best data platform to build your AI solutions on, right? Like all AI is driven by data, right? And we want to make sure we have the best pipelines, the best data platform, and the best algorithms so that you can build the applications that you want on top as efficiently and as effectively as possible, right? So, we're looking at things like integrating with, LLM APIs that Vertex AI offers. Again, you don't have to move your data. You can just call directly, even directly from within a SQL query. I remember the first time I used BigQuery ML. Within 30 lines of SQL, I'd created a training set and a test set. I'd split the data, built the model, trained it, tested it. And it was like, wow, that's amazing. 30 lines of a SQL with an Arima Plus model, super simple. But I was like, wow, like that would be a whole other thing for me to accomplish outside of this experience. So I think just making it very easy for customers to use these models with their data, right, is one huge thing. Now, the other part, I think, which is very interesting, is like, how can we use LLMs to improve the experiences of our customers, right? So there's building solutions, but we can also use LLMs to improve experiences for our customers, right? And we've announced some of what I would call as like the starting point of these, with things like Chat Assist, Code Assist, to help the data people, the data analysts, data scientists, data engineers, just be more productive in their language and their documentation and finding answers, right? Now, I think we can go even further with that and start to really think about like higher level automated experiences where, maybe I don't need to be now manually searching for data. Maybe the system is able to understand the queries that have been ran in my organization before, and people who are like me because they're in my group or have the same title and are able to prompt me with ideas for getting started. Because sometimes one of the hardest problems is just frankly getting started. Someone will send you a giant data catalog and a big gnarly query, and it's like, okay, now I've got to from here figure out if I've got the right data set and the right let's clear all that out of the way and just make it very easy for customers to get started with a very simple experience. And then if they need to fall through into a more sophisticated tooling, then that path is there. But my hope would be we can start to solve like 80% of those basic use cases with just a very simple experience.
And I think that's an important point, right? Because that 80% still requires some, human interaction to make it make it 100%, right? So, and we are not really eliminating, the human element in this. As you put through, we are assisting the humans, right? And we are assisting different personas on achieving that. So at the same time, we hear a lot of organizations, going through this journey, but they're also failing to, in certain occasions, and this has been very well documented by a lot of analyst organizations as well, right? To demonstrate the value that particularly generative AI brings to the organizations, right? Because it is it is a trade-off. How much effort that you are putting in, how much resources you are using, and what value that you are getting as well. So what value do you think does the generative AI bring to the organizations, and where do you see that leading to?
Yeah, I mean, one of our customers put this really nicely. They said, "Look, my role, there's only two things I can do. I can save money or I can make money, right? Like that's what I have to figure out for my business, right?" And Gen AI kind of plays into both of these. Maybe more so at the moment in the applications we're seeing on the creative side, right? Like if we can make a broader group of people more creative, able to answer more questions more quickly, they will be more productive in answering whichever questions they have, whether it be trying to analyze cost saving opportunities in a business or new revenue generation opportunities in a business, right? The ROI is always a super important thing to think about as you think about like kind of that measurable impact. And this is where we have to think about how we are able to better sort of attribute and understand the full costs of running some of these systems, right? So that people can really understand the ROI. For the Gen AI part, we're somewhat in the early stages of that, right? There's entire industries that are nervous about like how the path is going to go forward for them. They tend to be more on the sort of the like pure creative side. And I think the capabilities and what we've seen so far in terms of helping people discover, try, generate, explore, just with the creative process, I think is very powerful. So I think there's a lot of productivity opportunities here. And what I always remember examples when I go talk to a customer. And I'm like, okay, so you have a business problem to solve. How do you do it? And it's like, well, we take somebody from the business team and we bring a data scientist together and we bring a data engineer together and we put them together in a room and then they talk about how they're going to solve this problem. And I'm like, first of all, I say, congratulations that you have those people in your organization and have thought to organize them and ask them these questions, because like that is actually skills, like availability of skills that have domain, business, data knowledge is very hard, right? So, but there's only a limited number of those people and they can only work and interact on so many projects at the same time, right? So how can we really simplify those interactions so that there's much more, I'd love to get to a much more sort of self-service model, but one that is kind of governed and controlled. It's like, okay, you can do whatever you want within these parameters, right? You can run these models, but we're going to manage the cost or the amount of CPU resource that can use, because there's other business critical reports that need to run at this time. You can have access to this data, but not this data, right? Yep, you can put this in production, but only run it at this kind of scale. If it really starts to scale, then we might come back and talk to you about how to do that, right? So lots of opportunities there in terms of understanding the ROI.
And it's interesting, right? And also the opportunity cost is important as well, because, rather than focusing on the projects that will add the most value to your organization, sometimes you can go into some rabbit holes and it takes lots of time for you to get out of it as well. So sometimes we really need to experiment, and fail fast and see what value there will be as well. So,
Yeah.
and I want to, look ahead a little bit in, AI and data warehousing in particular. So what do you believe is the most exciting, potential applications and uses of this that we have yet to see, right? There's lots of noise, lots of things coming through, but what we haven't heard, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we're really sort of thinking about how can we improve sort of individual productivity, right? And I think when we can start to think about how can we really help organizations really scale and operate their businesses in new ways, I think we really then start to sort of break through into sort of new levels of scale and opportunity, because ultimately we're trying to help people experiment faster, right? And I loved how you phrased in that last question is like, customers are trying to experiment, right? And you've got to kind of come in with that experiment mindset. And if experiments are hard, you're not going to do many, right? But if experiments are easy, you're going to do lots. And if you can check if they're failing fast, great, right? You can then iterate and iterate and iterate. And if we can help customers through that journey, whether they're doing that for product recommendations, anomaly detection, like all the kinds of opportunities that we have for, not just Gen AI, but sort of classic AI use cases as well. I think that's very powerful, because I think there's a lot we can still do there. And I do think some of the sort of the retrieval augmented generation workflows are going to be particularly interesting as customers look to leverage I've got the ambiguity handled now, but now I need to refine it. And then I think the other thing which is going to really be interesting is, okay, imagine companies that are successful at doing this, right? They're going to want to run it at really large scale, right? And then the economics of like really start to kick in, right? Calling a couple of LLM APIs to test, okay, fine. Calling hundreds of thousands an hour, right, really starts to make you think about, hey, what are the economics of operating these systems at scale, right? So then starting to find ways that, we can save customers from calling hundreds of thousands of API calls to do something, right? Like with vector indexes, we can do clustering and classification. You can create a vector index on, say, an image once, store it in a vector index, and you can then run clustering nearest neighbor on it. And that's, really helping customers sort of get to scale points with this as they get through the experimentation phase.
And I really like the way that you put through as well, because now we are using generative AI to create all those vector indexes to be able to go and search for it. But whilst we are searching, we are using more classical AI to apply nearest neighbor and then find out what are the how that relationships works as well, right? So and I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. So, and my last question is, what advice would you give to individuals and businesses who are really looking to prepare a future, right? It is changing, and AI is going to play an even more significant role.
Yeah, you just have to be willing to. It's for me very heavily about investing in your people and your organization, right? So help your people experiment, like give them the tools, give them the permission, give them the space, give them the encouragement, let them fail, let them learn, right? Create a learning environment that they can, really like develop their own skills in the context of your business, right? That's a great investment in your organization's talent pool. It's actually, I found organizations do this, actually attract talent because of this as well, right? It's a virtuous cycle. So if you can really get into that and encourage that sort of experimentation cycle, then that is very, very powerful.
Yes, and I agree. And I think both of us comes more with the science and engineering backgrounds, and that is naturally we learned as ropes, if you like, that you have to test and fail and iterate, right? So that's the only way to get to success, and I quite like as well. Thank you really for joining us today, Dave. It has been incredibly insightful to hear your thoughts on the impact and effective use of AI, and we look forward to seeing how AI will continue to shape the world around us, and hope our viewers will be inspired to embrace its potential and opportunities.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed chatting today.